He thought he saw a banker's clerk descending from the bus. He looked again and found it was a hippopotamus. Perception takes place by means of sense organs. But the two most important things to remember about perception are these. Firstly, that we must not confuse the percept with its cause. That is, I do not hear undulating molecules of air. The name of what I hear is sound. Likewise, I do not touch a moving system of waves or of atoms and electrons with relatively vast empty spaces between them. The name of what I touch is matter. Secondly, I do not perceive any thing with my sense organs alone, but with a great part of my whole human being. Thus I may say loosely that I hear a thrush singing, but in strict truth all that I ever merely hear, that is, all that I ever hear simply by virtue of having ears, is sound. When I, quote-unquote, hear a thrush singing, I'm hearing not with my ears alone, but with all sorts of other things like mental habits, memory, imagination, feeling, and, to the extent at least that the act of attention involves it, with will. Of someone who merely heard in the first sense, that is, by virtue of simply having ears, it could meaningfully be said that although he can hear, he hears not. I do not think either of these two maxims depends on any particular theory of the nature of perception. On almost any received theory of perception, the familiar world, that is, the world which is simply apprehended, is for the most part dependent upon the percipient. It may be expedient at this point to examine a little further the collective representations and our thinking about them, and it is clearly of little use to begin by asking what they are, since they are everything that is obvious. They are, for instance, the desk I am writing at, the noise of the door being opened downstairs, a Union Jack, an altar in a church, the smell of coffee, a totem pole, the view from Melvin Hills, and the bit of brain tissue that is being dissected before a group of students in a hospital laboratory. Some of these representations we can manipulate, as the lecturer is doing, and some of them we cannot. What is important here is that there are, broadly speaking, three different things that we can do with all of them, or alternatively, they are related to the mind in three different ways. First, we can simply contemplate or experience them, as when I simply look at the view, or encounter the smell. The whole impression appears then to be given to me in the representation itself, for I am not, or I am not very often aware, of smelling an unidentified smell and then thinking, that is coffee. It appears to me, and it appears instantly, that I smell coffee, though in fact I can no more merely smell coffee than I can merely hear a thrush singing. This immediate impression or experience of a familiar world has already been mentioned. It is important to be clear about it. It is plainly the result of an activity of some sort in me, however little I may recollect any such activity. Ought it to be called a mental activity? Whatever it ought to be called, it really is the percipient's own contribution to the representation. It is all that in the representation which is not sensation. For as the organs of sense are required to convert the unrepresented quote-unquote particles into sensations for us, so something is required in us to convert sensations into things. It is this something that I mean, and it will avoid confusion if I purposely choose an unfamiliar and little-used word and call it, at the risk of infelicity, figuration. Now, whether or not figuration is a mental activity, that is, a kind of thinking, it is clearly not, or it is not characteristically, a thinking about. The second thing, therefore, that we can do with the representations is to think about them. Here, as before, we remain unconscious of the intimate relation which they in fact have, as representations, with our own organisms and minds. For now our very attitude is to treat them as independent of ourselves, to accept their outness as self-evidently given, and to speculate about or to investigate their relations with each other. One could perhaps name this process theorizing or theoretical thinking, since it is exactly what is done in most places where science is pursued. But I do not think the term is wide enough. Therefore, at the like hazard as before, I propose to call this particular kind of thinking alpha thinking. The third thing that we can do with the representations is to think about the nature of collective representations as such, and therefore about their relation to our own minds. We can think about perceiving, and we can think about thinking. We can do, in fact, the kind of thinking which I am trying to do at the moment, and which you will be doing if you think I am right, and also if you think I am wrong. It has been called reflection or reflective thinking, but for the same reasons as before I shall reject the simpler and more elegant term and call it beta thinking. The three operations, figuration, alpha thinking, and beta thinking, are clearly distinguishable from one another, but that is not to say that they are divided by impassable barriers at the points where they mutually approach. Indeed, the opposite is true. Moreover, they may affect each other by reciprocal influence. He thought he saw a banker's clerk descending from the bus. He looked again, and found it was a hippopotamus. This is, of course, only a very improbable instance of an experience which, in itself, is quite common, especially with those among our representations which reach us through the sense of sight alone. When we mistake one representation, that is to say, one thing, for another, so that there is a transition from an "I thought I saw" to an "I found it was," it is often very difficult indeed to say whether there is first a figuration, based, let us say, on incomplete sensation, and then another and different figuration producing a different representation, or whether there is one and the same representation veiled from us at first by some incorrect alpha thinking which is subsequently discarded as inapplicable. Either way, we must conclude that figuration, whether or not it is a kind of thinking, is something which easily and imperceptibly passes over into thinking, and into which thinking easily and imperceptibly passes over. For in both cases there was a representation, otherwise I should not have been deceived. And if the first representation was the result of incorrect thinking, then thinking can do something very much like what figuration does. Alternatively, if it was the result of figuration alone, then the very fact that figuration can quote-unquote make a mistake suggests that it has a good deal in common with thinking. Many thanks. Until next time. Goodbye.